Well, good afternoon and happy Sabbath. It's good to see you all here. I'm glad we can be here together. And as we are continuing our study through the book of Job, I hope that we will all be truly blessed. Let's have a word of prayer as we begin. Father in heaven, thank you so much for giving us the privilege of having your word that can touch our hearts, our minds, our lives. And as we're here together, as we're meeting, I ask that you can help us to fix our eyes upon you, fix our vision upon you, that we may be blessed. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Job chapter 2 is where we will start today. And as we're starting, I'd like to tell you a story that April and Bailey, you'll have to forgive me because I know you heard this just a short time ago. But there's a medieval proverb that I just recently learned that I think is very fitting for the story of Job. And as the medieval proverb goes, it tells the story of a farmer who lived out in, of course, a very agrarian society, one that depended on growing your food to live. And in this society, he had one prized possession, his horse. Now, a horse during those times was not just a nice way of having a hobby of something to ride, but these were how you got around, how you went from place to place. It was also how you kept your fields cultivated and tilled. And this was his one animal, and yet the farmer's horse one day ran away. It got away, and all the people of the village came out, and they came to the farmer, and they said to the farmer, "You must be cursed. You must be cursed because God has allowed your horse to run away." And the farmer simply replied with his solemn face. He just said one word, "Maybe." Well, the village people were puzzled, and they were puzzled by the farmer's response until a couple days later, the horse, miraculously, on the edge of the village, there was a commotion as the horse came out of the forest, having returned. And yet the commotion also grew even louder because the horse did not return alone. The horse returned with 10 other wild horses that it had found and made friends with out in the forest. And so now the people of the village were even more amazed. They came to the farmer and they said, "Wow, we were wrong. The one horse had left and now 10 horses have returned. You've gone from the poorest man in the village to the wealthiest man in the village, all in a moment. What have you done to make God bless you so much?" And he said just one word, "Maybe." Well, the villagers were once again puzzled. How could this man have such a simple response to what was obviously such a great thing? Well, the farmer and his son were training the horses, and they were breaking in one of the horses when it threw the farmer's son from his saddle. And the young man landed on the ground and broke his leg. And so all the villagers came back to the farmer and they said, "How you must be cursed by God because God has allowed your son to break his leg." And the farmer just said, well, guess what he said? "Maybe." It wasn't a few weeks after that soldiers, the king's knights, came into the town, and they let everyone know that they would be recruiting every able-bodied young man. And so all the young men were gathered up and taken to a war that they would never return from. All except for one young man who a few weeks earlier had broken his leg. You know, this story puts in perspective that today's trials can be tomorrow's salvation. Today's disaster can be tomorrow's deliverance. And nowhere do we see this idea depicted better or clearer than in the book of Job. We don't know the future. We don't know the ways in which God is working. And sometimes we think, "God, how could you allow this to happen to me? Why are you letting this happen to me?" And here we studied, the last time we gathered in the book of Job, here we studied that Job had a very, very difficult week or a very difficult day that no one could imagine. This supremely difficult day, and yet he trusted God anyways. Job recognized that his future was not in his own hands, but it was in the hands of the Lord. And I think this story demonstrates to us that while we may not always realize how God is working now, the story of Job gives us confidence that God is always working according to what is best. But the story of Job after chapter 1 gets worse before it gets better. Turn with me, if you will, Job chapter 2, starting in verse 1. After this controversy has happened in heaven, this terrible judgment, or this terrible trial, rather, has been outpoured on Job by Satan. And in Job 2, verse 1, we pick up the story of Job again. And again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered and said, "From going back and forth, from going to and fro and on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Does verse 1 and 2 sound a little bit familiar in the story of Job? It sure does, doesn't it? This is almost word for word what happened in the earlier chapter, what happened in heaven. We see again there's this gathering, again Satan comes, and Satan's right to come is the fact that he is represented in what world? In our world, right? On earth. And so he says, "Well, I've come from going back to and fro upon the earth, from walking back and forth on it." And like I said earlier, this is Satan's way of saying, the earth is my domain. The earth is my dominion, and I can go wherever I want. And God will respond in a similar way that he did last time. He says this. Verse 3, "So the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth? A blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil.'" Again, this is the very same thing he said in the last verse, but he goes on, in the last chapter rather, but he goes on and says, "And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." I find something very interesting about this verse. You know, Job is often used as a reference point to the fact that evil is never caused by God, it's caused by who? By Satan, right? And we often turn to the story of Job to express this idea. And yet here, God says, "And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." You know, I find this very fascinating because who caused or who really brought the destruction to Job, according to the Bible in the earlier chapter? Satan did. God says, "Well, I've drawn this hedge of protection around Job. I'm going to allow you to come this far but no further." And yet here in chapter 2, who does God assign the responsibility to for what has happened to Job? What I find fascinating is that God assigns the responsibility upon himself. Notice he says, "Although you, Satan, incited me against him to destroy him without cause." You know, at first I found this a little bit bothersome, that God was saying that he had destroyed Job without cause. Because, as we saw in the last chapter, it was Satan who had destroyed Job without cause. And at first I found it a little bit disturbing. Does God sometimes work against us? But as I realized what God meant by this, what God was saying through this, I found something very comforting in the message of Job chapter 2, verse 3. God doesn't blame Satan for our woes because he still has us in his hands. He will not allow Satan to do more or less than what God allows him to do. And although Satan is the one who has done this work, God recognizes that he still has Job in his care. That nothing will happen to Job that God will not take responsibility for. And furthermore, God has a reason for what has happened to Job. God has a plan. God has a purpose. We don't know the plan or purpose, but as Romans 8:28 says, "For we know that all things work together for good to those who love God." I imagine if Job would have found out in his older years that his 10 children would have left the faith, then he would have praised the Lord that God allowed their lives to be taken before that happened. We don't know if that would have happened because we don't know the future. And as that story began in the very beginning, sometimes today's disaster is tomorrow's deliverance. We don't know the end from the beginning. Job certainly doesn't know the end from the beginning. And what's fascinating about this story is Job will never receive all the answers. And yet God will take responsibility for what has happened to Job. I find that very comforting that God will never allow something in our lives when we have given our lives to him. He will never allow something to happen in our lives that he is not willing to bear the burden for. He is always willing to work for our best. And when life gets difficult, God is not arbitrarily off in heaven, harping on some golden harp on a cloud and eating grapes. God is with us in the trenches. Verse 4. So Satan answered the Lord and said to him, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that man has he will give for his life, but stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to his face." Now I find Satan's answer diabolical. Satan has certainly tested Job enough, and Job has been found to stand faithful for the Lord. And Satan was basically saying here, yes, Job is either a loyal servant of you, or he is so selfish, so psychopathically self-centered, that he doesn't care about his possessions. He doesn't care about his family as long as he is doing all right. What an accusation for Satan to level against someone who has stood firm for the Lord in such traumatic circumstances. He says Job doesn't care about all that as much as he cares about his own skin. He doesn't care about his family or his possessions or his household or any of those people that I took away as much as he does his own life. A man will do anything for his own life, and Job only serves you for fear that if he turned against you, that you would kill him. You know, Satan always likes to pin the worst attributes, the worst character on those that he accuses. Verse 6, "And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." Here we see again that God is allowing Satan to bring trials to Job, but only to a limit. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd, which is a piece of broken pottery, to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of ashes. How far has Job fallen in circumstances from what we see his life is like in Job 1:1-5? As we were first introduced to Job, we see a healthy man, a rich man, a man with a large amount of possessions, with a large amount of livestock, with a large household, with 10 children. And now we see a man alone, broken, having lost everything. Well, almost everything. We're going to see one thing soon that he didn't lose. He lost everything, and he's scraping himself with a piece of pottery. Verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." There's a Christian comedian named Tim Hawkins who made a very interesting observation about the book of Job, where Satan takes away Job's children, he takes away Job's health, he takes away all Job's stuff, but notice that Satan leaves one person behind, Job's wife. And as this comedian observed, maybe some of Satan's angels said, "Hey, Satan, you forgot to take care of Job's wife. You forgot to, why'd you leave her alive? Did you realize that?" And Satan is just thinking, just wait, because the very person that should have been there to support Job during this time, what does his own wife, say to Job in this moment? Curse God and die. Not only is this encouragement, but I would imagine for someone going through grief, would this be difficult for you to hear for the person with which you're sharing your own life with? Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity?" And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. In everything that Job has said, we see a supreme trust in God. He will accept both good and adversity. Things that he likes, things that he doesn't like. His loyalty to God is unconditional. And again, I'm inspired by his example. Do we have that same kind of unconditional loyalty to God? Verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that came upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar off, they did not recognize him. And they lifted their voices and wept, and each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Here we see that while his wife may not have supported Job, there will be 3 people who have come to support Job during this trying and difficult time. And oftentimes we hear of these 3 friends after having read the perspective of Job in maybe not the most positive way. But I want us to take into account what these friends have come for. They haven't come to criticize Job. They haven't come to condemn Job. They've come to mourn with Job. And as they come in the distance, their grief is so great because when they see Job for the first time, they don't even recognize who he is. I can't imagine what Job has had to go through in just this recent amount of time. But we can see that Job has had a trying circumstance above all trying circumstances. He's had a trial above all trials. And at this particular time, he is on his knees in the dirt, scraping off his boils, and he is unrecognizable to his own friends. Notice his friends, they join him on the ground. They tear off their robes, and they stay outside in the soil with him for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have ever had someone there to support you in a time of need. But if you had friends who came and sat with you outside, through the cold, through the hot, through the windy, through the rainy, through the beating sun, for 7 days and 7 nights without saying a single thing, that sounds like a friend that you'd like to have in a trial, wouldn't it? These were good friends. Well, we'll see that they weren't perfect friends. So they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and they saw that his grief was very great. You know, this is a terrible thing to admit, but there's a human tendency that when we watch people mourn, we have compassion for a time, and yet eventually we have moved on and we expect them to move on as well. We're going to see that that may happen with his friends. Chapter 3, verse 1, we can see after this 7 days and 7 nights, and Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said, "May the day perish on which I was born. On the night which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may the darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not be counted in the number of months. Oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come from it. May those curse it with the curse who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse the Leviathan. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for the light, but have none. And may it not have the dawning of the day. Because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes." I think that this is something that if we heard a friend of ours say, we would think that they're losing touch of their faith and losing touch on reality. Here we have this intense experience where Job, while he's not cursing God, is cursing the day that he was born. He's realizing this life is so difficult that I wish I would have never had it to begin with. You know, it's not that Job had any superhuman strength that didn't make him feel the pain of the trial that he was going through. And I think that chapter 3 is invaluable to us to show us that Job wasn't any different from you or I in the fact that he felt immense sorrow in this trial that he was going through. This sorrow was so intense he wished he would have never been born. He felt that life was so terrible that he could not endure it any longer. And yet he didn't turn his back on God. He didn't stop worshiping the Lord. And yet that experience of Job's faithfulness is counted as even more valuable when it's in contrast to his emotional suffering. We can see in chapter 3 that Job didn't have some superhuman emotional strength. He was feeling this pain. He was feeling the trials of his circumstances. And yet in this, he never cursed God. He never stopped worshiping God. If we go down together to verse 20 of chapter 3. Why is light given to him who is in misery, a life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they can find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? For my sign comes before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet, for I have no rest, for trouble comes. Here Job says, why does God still sustain me when I long for death more than hidden treasure? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden? Here Job recognizes, he says, God must have a way that's hidden. There must be something beyond the darkness. God is still sustaining me. He's giving light. But why? Why couldn't God just let me die? We see here in Job chapter 3 that Job, although he is trusting in God, is also searching for something else. He's searching for answers. what is this plan? What is God's plan? Why is light being given to me, even in the darkness of times? And he says, I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. In chapter 4, we see an interesting response. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? So here, Job's friend is saying, well, I've sat here in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, but after you've said all this, I feel like I need to say something. I have something to say. And I imagine that Eliphaz would have felt that he earned the right to say something after having been this friend that was with Job during these moments of adversity. We know that Eliphaz has compassion on Job, that Eliphaz is close to Job, but there's something that sets Eliphaz apart from Job. If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who is stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Is not your reverence your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or were the upright ever cut off? So here Eliphaz is saying that Job has taught others in many other times. He's helped other people in many other times. And yet here Eliphaz has something he needs to say to Job. He says, is your own reverence your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? In other words, he's saying, why are you so confident that this isn't something that you have done? Now, I find this interesting. Eliphaz has the expectation and the experience that what you do determines what you receive and how God behaves to you. And when you look at this perspective, you really understand that Eliphaz's misunderstanding is not of Job's character, but of God's character. Oftentimes we look at Job's friends and we think that they didn't trust Job enough. And yet this was a man who had come and traveled to sit with Job in his misery, who had traveled to be with Job in the darkest of his times, who had sat with Job in 7 days and nights in silence. And we can see here that his confidence is not in what God has planned, but Eliphaz's view of God is that what God does for you is determined on what you do for him. How common is that perspective in our world today? How often do we even think that what God does for us depends on what we do for him? Job is saying that he's going to trust God no matter what, that his trust in God is unconditional, but here Eliphaz is accusing God and Job of having their loyalty being conditional. In other words, he says, remember, whoever perished being innocent, or were the upright ever cut off? Verse 8, even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the blast of God they perished, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. The roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lion are broken. Job trusts God enough to say that the same God who is with us in triumph is with us also in adversity. Job trusts God enough to say that from the same God may come both blessing and adversity, and yet we should trust him all the same. And yet, for Eliphaz, he says, how could God still love you and allow this to happen? Instead of trusting that God would show the answers, Eliphaz concludes to himself that there must be something that Job has done to deserve this. That's the only other logical conclusion. You know, when I think about our lives, we see that the friends will continue on, imploring that Job must have done something wrong, that it must be Job's fault. When we look at the fatal misunderstanding that Job's friends had, it wasn't that they didn't love and care for Job, because that was evident. It wasn't that they didn't want to help Job, because that was also evident. They had Job's best interest in mind. And yet they thought they were only thinking in human terms of what human actions could see, of what human actions could do. And they didn't trust God enough to realize that God still had a plan. You know, how often do we think that the results of our existence are determined inside of us instead of resting in the hands of God? Job is searching for answers. Eliphaz is searching for answers, but he's not searching for answers in God. He's searching for answers in Job. The problem must be in what Job has done. We're going to see that for a long time, they keep hounding Job with this story. For chapters and chapters, they implore Job to repent. Each one of them implores Job to repent in turn. All the way up until chapter 11, they have this conversation with Job over and over about whose fault human suffering is. And I would greatly encourage us to read all this on our own time. There's this conversation of whose fault is human suffering? Is it God's fault? Is it Job's fault? Is it no one's fault? Through it all, Job continues to trust in the Lord. You know, when we look for our future and when we look through the ways of life, we often think in very human terms instead of understanding that we need to be searching for God's higher perspective. Often we react completely to our circumstances as Eliphaz is urging Job to do. And yet Job realizes that he is going to wait until the Lord reveals his plan. Are we so patient that when we are going through trials, when we are going through temptation and suffering, that we wait until God shows us his plan? I pray that each one of us can have this transformational experience, that we can trust God for his plan. This week, I would encourage each one of us, as we are going about our week, as we are going through maybe the smaller trials. None of us are going through trials like Job is going through, but in the smaller trials of this week, that we look for God's plan. We say, Lord, I'm going to wait till I can figure out what you have for me to do. I'm going to trust that you have a way. I'm going to trust that you take responsibility not only for the good times, but for the bad times as well. I'm going to trust that you have my life in your hand. The whole fundamental experience of the Bible is having faith in God no matter what. Are we willing to put our lives in God's hand? Our closing hymn today is Abide With Me. Hymn number 50, Abide With Me. This is one of my favorite hymns, and I hope that this will be our prayer this week. That no matter what comes, that we will abide with God, that we will realize his plan, that we will realize that God has a hope and a future for us, even when we cannot see it ourselves. Please stand with me as we sing hymn number 50, Abide.